I've been an editor of books that have appeared at the sessions, and I've also been an expert, as I was this year. So I've seen from different perspectives. And of course, I've been involved in the project from the start, so I can get a sense of how this year was very different, for obvious reasons, than previous years. So the first thing I would say is I thought all of the experts and the authors adapted as best they could to a very difficult circumstance. And certainly we want to express our appreciation and thanks to all of them. That being said, there are significant problems with trying to do this on Zoom. And I would break those down in sort of two different ways. The first is just Zoom itself. Zoom requires a lot less flexibility in running sessions, so they become very stilted. Obviously, you have to stick to time limits, and as the session goes on, people develop what everyone now calls Zoom fatigue, which is very real. As you're on Zoom for an hour and a half, you begin to have difficulty following what's going on. I'm teaching a graduate seminar that's 2.5 hours long, and the last 45 minutes is very problematic. And I have excellent students, but at the end of a certain amount of Zoom time, it's very difficult for people. The dinner sessions, the lunches, the informal visits are absolutely critical to developing personal relationships between the experts and the editors and the authors. And so what happens is that it builds confidence and it builds a personal relationship, so the authors are more receptive to the comments made by the experts. And I thought it was very clear in the sessions this year that at least one of the sessions, the author was very standoffish about receiving the criticisms from the experts, more so than I've ever seen in any of our in-person sessions. And I thought that had a lot to do with just the fact that we're on Zoom. So that's a critical thing, number one. The second one is we're dealing here sometimes with people who are not simply working on Poland, but other places. Many of them bring pre-existing prejudice about Poland and East Central Europe in general to the sessions. And it's very important to break that down, both in terms of private conversations, which I have often had with colleagues because I'm a specialist of Western Europe. And so if I talk to them about the Commonwealth period, for example, they put more confidence in me. I'm not one of these terrible Poles who's chauvinistic or whatever. I'm just a French historian. So obviously I must be telling the truth about Poland or something. I don't know what they think, but that plays a significant role. It shouldn't be underestimated. And then they become more receptive. And then the obvious thing is, of course, if we're visiting places, then people start to see connections for themselves. We can talk to them all we want about, you know, what a multicultural place the early modern Commonwealth was, but there's nothing quite like going to Zamość and seeing the house of a Jewish merchant, an Armenian merchant, an Italian merchant, a German, just one after the other, and some of the other places we visited, or seeing the contrast between Krakow and Warsaw just on a simple basis. This is something that is really important for a lot of our authors who are not necessarily specialists on Poland. I would say the key thing with the missing with outside, absolutely essential, is the informal conversations between experts and authors after the session. And I'll give two examples of that. One was from last year when, as an editor from Cambridge, one of my authors, Philip Slavetsky, was there, and we had a session in Kiev. Now, we had a very nice session, and Philip and I talked a little bit about it afterwards. But then we had a long walk through Kiev with Adam Klochowski and John Merriman and myself and a couple others. We walked up to, we were walking around for about an hour. There's no question in my mind that that's when Philip really grasped what they were trying to tell him, right? It wasn't just at the session, it was afterwards when I'm talking with them and we're going over different things. And the critical thing there is that kind of discussion enables the author to see the whole picture, right? I'll come back to that when I talk about the sessions inside. The second example is Andrzej Novak, whom we now had twice with the same book, the Pilsudski book, which we had 2 years ago. And then we had again this year where it's more in a final state. All right, so 2 years ago, if I remember correctly, at the end, I think Novak had to leave halfway because we had a session and we had coffee and then we continued. And he had to leave. So he just sat down with the author and we had to wait to start up after coffee because the two of them were off in the corner of the room. And he's talking with this guy, Zimmerman. And it was very obvious this year that Zimmerman clearly had listened to it and had changed a lot of what we had done. So we can see there now on Zoom, that conversation doesn't take place. It's just not because anybody's terrible, but because it's Zoom. No, that doesn't happen. All right. So that kind of stuff is absolutely essential to our project. Now, if we then think about in the sessions, all right, so I would say there are 3 or 4 key elements. The first one is our lack of any sort of free-flowing discussion. Now, most of the time we'll have a series of points and we'll go along, but then obviously you've sat in and you know that sometimes we'll have these discussions that sort of interrupt the flow of the, this page, that page, and we'll have a multi-person discussion that goes on for 15 or 20 minutes. We didn't have any of those on Zoom. That's not possible. All right. And those are absolutely critical to give the author context for the change. It's not enough to say, well, on page 322, I want you to change this, and this is why. Great. All right. What's the context of that? You can't expect an author to internalize that and really grasp why the change has to be made unless the author has a context for, well, why does this matter that way on 322? Why have I got to change this stuff? All right. Now, as part of that, another thing which is completely gone in Zoom, we have a lot of really interesting author-to-author conversations. And I might say also editor-to-editor conversations. Because, for example, we've had books that started off with one editor and ended up with a different one because of the conversations they had at the session. I know at least 2 that happened. All right. So how do the authors talk? There's no author-to-author discussion on Zoom. They're having a one-to-one with the people who are commenting on their text. But they're not having coffee afterwards with one of the other authors and saying, oh, I was really interested in your book. And we get this interplay among the authors, many of whose books are related. There's none of that on Zoom. All right. So that's another critical loss for the authors. Right. And, as I said before, the key thing is that in the sessions, I thought this year that authors were losing the sense of the overall manuscript, right? And you might think, all of us then sent written things like I did Andrei Seshelmi's thing, and I sent him a very long series of points, and I also sent him an email, and I sent him some stuff I wrote. Why? Because we couldn't do any of that stuff like normal human beings. Right? Where we could talk about his overall manuscript, or he and I could have a beer or a coffee or whatever, a vodka, whatever we're going to do later, walk around Warsaw and chat about his book and chat about some of the things he needed to do. That's it. You can't do that. Right? And so the authors lose that. And I would say as an editor, to put on a different hat, that it's a very problematic process to put your author through. Now, I didn't have any authors this year. Obviously, I had one last year, but I did not have one this year, so I was not an editor. But I would not be surprised if some of the editors felt like, we have to do Zoom again. I'm not sure I really want to do this with my authors. Because it's not that the individual points raised by the critics are not great. They are great, and they're a big help to authors. But they're not going to be very much help improving a book unless the author can place them in a larger context of the overall manuscript. And that's pretty much impossible to do, I thought, on Zoom.